It's not just about fixing another person's problem, it's about fixing the problems that we all suffer from.
What does it mean to try and imagine a future, not just after collapse, but while the collapse is still happening? I'm Ariana, your host at Sounds Like Change, and I've spent the last 10 years working in the intersection between music and social justice. Sounds Like Change is a podcast where we have discussions with leading artists and change makers about how they use music as a tool to help them imagine and build a future that we all want to live in. Today, I have the honour of being joined by Mohammed Usrof. He's a Palestinian climate justice advocate, political strategist and researcher who was born in Khan Yunis, Gaza. He's also the founder of the Palestinian Institute for Climate Strategy and a thinker who asks some of the most urgent questions of our time. His work and what you're going to hear today spans themes like climate justice, decolonisation, energy systems, and collective liberation. What makes Mohammed's work so vital is his refusal to separate things that are often treated as distinct. Ecology from occupation, climate from colonialism, or politics from imagination. In this conversation, we explore what it means to imagine after devastation and how hope can be built collectively rather than individually. And also why art, identity, liberation can never be disentangled. Every week, I start with the same question to each guest, which is what song most faithfully captures the future you want to help build and why? Mohammed chose The Spoils by Massive Attack. Okay, Mohammed, thank you so much for being here on Sounds Like Change. The first question that I ask all guests, why did you choose the song that we just listened to?
Absolutely. So we just listened to Spoils by Massive Attack. It's a song that drives a lot of kind of hope in me, partially because of the music. I'm a big fan of sci-fi music, and I'm a big fan of the general like solar punk aesthetic. Even within cyberpunk elements, that song does have a lot of references to that. But for me, this whole idea of having music, creating an energy of at least vision for a future is really crucial. And I think that song does that perfectly, especially with the way it builds up into more kind of, into just a wave that feels constructive in essence. It starts off slow with little beats and then kind of builds up into a just an energy that feels hopeful, that feels romantic with a society that could come together, as opposed to other songs that are just a bit either too quiet or too loud. I feel like this is just the perfect noise that in our current moment, I feel like fills in the gap and fills in the silence that we need.
And I think you just said that so beautifully. And there was something that you mentioned actually in an email that you sent a couple of days ago about wanting to choose a song that sits in a kind of liminal space. And I really loved that choice of words and this idea of sort of sitting in between collapse and possibility. And yeah, I'd love to know just what a liminal space means to you personally and maybe also politically with where we are.
No, absolutely. I mean, we're more than 600 days into a genocide. It's been more than 2 years into the ongoing sort of genocide in Palestine, and it's a catastrophe. And I think more than ever before, it's a point in history where we have to question ourselves as to how did we get here. But from a personal lens, this has been painful. It's been destructive to our own systems as Palestinians, our identity, our culture. Genocide is an eraser, and it's an extermination of a people, of their culture, of their memory, of their scholarship and knowledge, in every meaning of the word, what people constitute, tradition, belief, etc. And we've seen this wave of generally anti-Muslim agendas, or even anti-Arab. And I think more than ever, we really desperately need people to come together and question ourselves as to how did we get here and why are we here at this point and when is it going to stop. We had some hope when the ceasefire agreement sort of was agreed on 2 months ago or so, but we also saw how that didn't continue. And now we're seeing that more than ever before, because we're now meant to enter stage 2. But the question is, when did we ever have a stage 1 of the ceasefire? But how does that, that gap between complete devastation and then post-destruction, potential reconstruction, it's such a false question to begin with. How do we rebuild, or how do we think about Palestine post the genocide? Because the genocide hasn't ended. And as I said, it's an erasure that realistically many people have been killed and many families have been completely erased off of the records, and nothing can bring that back. So when we talk about reconstruction, when we talk about that gap in space, how could we ever fill it in? And music, I guess, in that sense, is an act of resistance in terms of how could we allow people to express their suffering and their pain in a way that could reach the people in the world. But also, more importantly, what are the kind of soundscapes and even noises that people have suffered through that allowed for their current reality to shape up the way that it did. I think more importantly, I see music and sounds in general creating a political imaginary. And the reason I say that is because being surrounded by either the sort of sounds of the drones humming and constantly buzzing, for more than 2 years now, but also being under siege. Like, for example, when I was in Gaza in 2014, what was very critical, what was very loud at the time was the engine hums, or the engine in general, when you would have a blackout and you would need to get the engine up and running to have electricity in the house. That would be its own soundscape. And it's something that, to me, when I hear, it always takes me back to Gaza. But then more importantly, the range of sounds that we would have, even when there's no electricity and no any form of energy, there's the energy of people that comes out. And I think it's very crucial to realize and recognize that people have their own energy and people have their own forms of expression that doesn't necessarily need to come in forms of energy, electricity, and even, especially in a world that is so, intertwined and entrenched in an oil and coal kind of culture. So, yeah.
There's so much in what you just said that I want to pick out on, and I want to go next to your work and the work that you're doing. There's a question I'd like to ask first, which is on something that you mentioned about sort of futurism and sort of links to even sci-fi, which I know you've mentioned in your email as well. But I think something you said which really struck a chord with me is, we are not out of the darkness. We're not out of the hell right now. And we are in a liminal space, but we're not at the point of reconstruction because we're not out of it. And that is absolutely horrific and catastrophic. And then there's people like yourself and so many others who are feeling the urgency and are stepping up into work and roles to try and create an end and actually create structures of our new future. So I really would like to talk about that in just a second. But firstly, just to stay on the theme of music, because you mentioned a couple times about, the importance of music and sound and you didn't quite mention it in these words, but what I took from it is almost like emotional metabolization. The having so much pain and trauma, being able to express it through music, that is a form of emotional metabolization, and that is in itself a form of energy, and that can create change in its own essence. And you mentioned a couple times about how sci-fi and futurism shapes your worldview and these kind of political possibilities that these kinds of fictions can unlock. So yeah, I'd love you to speak about that a little bit.
No, absolutely. So, you can maybe think about the current music industry and that whole landscape. I feel like that already says a lot the way it is. I think what we lack is more forms of just indigenous knowledge, sovereignty over our even music. And we see that first of all, the music industry is quite problematic from my perspective. There's a lot of different you also mentioned this idea of people jumping to different roles, and there's this, we live in a world where everything is so meshed together that even the ways that we as Palestinians and just non-Palestinians witnessing the genocide, everything is so intertwined in a way that is really disturbing. I mean, we listen to different kinds of music. We could listen to a child crying or a bomb hitting and people being killed, but then we could jump to the next thing in a second after, whether it's on Instagram or YouTube or whatever kind of platform of digital media and consumption that we have, and be completely desensitized to it. So I think the way that I see music is a form of expression that could eliminate that desensitization or even normalization of pain and suffering in a way that we're actually platforming these kind of musics and soundscapes. And from my even kind of, let's say, experience with sci-fi and futurism and political imaginaries, I always refer to the communities that I work with and my own community, and whether that's in the climate justice movement or in Palestinian organizing or even in different groups and communities and countries that I've been to, and the people that we work with on either the energy embargo or false climate solutions and so on. What really builds a lot of hope and builds a collective vision, and even from like a music lens, is that we all have, we're all human and we all have the same means of survival. We used to hunt and we eat and we thrive and we learn and we grow as people. But then the way that the world is currently systematized or created is constructed in a way that pulls us apart as communities. And I think one thing that also brings a lot of different communities together is play, and it's music, and it's, these activities that are very human intrinsically, and it's something that we really need to pursue that I don't think music today pursues anymore. Music is more of like a profit-making industry. Music is, it's no longer about the current moment. It's no longer political. I mean, the fact that we saw so many like bands and artists and even so-called like agents of change in a lot of the different spaces, whether it's under the UN or else, really withdrawing from this idea of politicizing their work, or even politicizing it the right way, because you can still politicize and profit out of it, or politicize it in a way that's tokenizing. Mm-hmm. And there's obviously saviorism in this whole issue that, could really be quite problematic. So just to go back to a more positive note, I think this whole industry needs liberation. I think we all need to be liberated, and I think I'll always say this as well, is that Palestine liberated all of us, even when Palestine is not technically free, but the people in Palestine are so disconnected from this global capitalist imperialist system that they are freeing us now when we do have their voices kind of platformed and on our radar. And it's just really shameful to see.
I mean, you're completely right. And this is the thing that a lot of people don't understand in our society here in the West. We are very not free. We're completely controlled by systems of oppression through our media, through capitalist structures. So I absolutely, and this is part of actually why, even we're doing this work on this podcast, and, everyone in the team really believes in transformation within the music industry. But I guess, as you say, art, it cannot be separated from politics, from even, the land, occupation, ecology, art, and all of these things. They go hand in hand, and being extracted from that, it almost creates an illusion, and this is what we're bought into. But I'd love to know, how do you, and this is the I don't want to say multi-million dollar because it's not about money, but this is the big question. How can we responsibly use art as a vehicle for these new systems that we're trying to create?
I'll just mention briefly a few things, perhaps, just to kind of build up to that answer. There's Palestinian music that often goes out of its own way to not necessarily respond to the current moment. And it does that out of resistance to the idea that Palestinians, being dehumanized or being seen as a, as a subject in the Middle East that is just being targeted or being under genocide, or even on the war spectrum of things, not under genocide and so on. Palestinians are worthy and are able to create music for their own, just the way that any human could. And it's people like, for example, there's a great sort of singer or artist, his name is Kukim, who does a lot of great music and doesn't necessarily respond to the current moment out of like, or doesn't necessarily does it politically, but he does it because of his own experience and identity as a Palestinian in the West Bank. And I think that's very beautiful, and that's something that, you know, that's a form of art that I could appreciate. But then there's also other forms of art that should come out now more than ever, and it's to build these connections that we're talking about. Earlier this year, around 2 months ago, the Palestinian Institute for Climate Strategy came out with this manifesto for ecological justice and Palestinian liberation, and that has been a great movement builder tool. It's been kind of integral to the climate movement, especially in different sort of scenes. We've had it socialized and kind of used in Sweden, in Mexico, in Colombia, in South Africa, and even in Brazil, more recently with COP30. And it's been incredible because of the way that people now see that to first be able to talk about climate justice, or to first be able to even address your own system of oppression, we got to recognize the interconnectedness between all the problems, and then we got to resist it in ways that, you know, we resist fossil capitalism, we resist the idea that life is normal this way. I mean, it's a complete rejection of the status quo, and that is the first recognition. But then how do you resist that? I think there's been this huge push for an energy embargo in Italy, in Colombia, in South Africa, in Turkey. And we see more than ever before this idea of energy being so entrenched in our system, and also to the imperial regime and the war machine in Gaza by Israel, that we need to kind of resist that and work together as people. And that, you know, what I'm trying to get to is that people mobilize together and people unionize and workers unionize. We've worked with unions for the Union of Oil Workers, the unions in Italy, and they've done an incredible job. And obviously, that whole energy itself plays a really deep like music of liberation. It's just like the drums of liberation to me. And having that consistently more than ever now as not just a response to the genocide, but a response to imperialism, a response to global capitalism and fossil capitalism is beautiful. And that gets us to the next point, is that once you recognize these issues and then you resist them, how do you rebuild? How do you build a vision for the future? How do you collectively imagine liberation, not just in Palestine, but across the 99% of the world? How can all people of all classes be able to live together on this one planet, instead of just being in this, you know, imagining that this global, you know, power dynamics and hierarchies are normal? So if we're unable to build that vision, then we're never going to reach that vision anyway. So that's where music and art comes in, and that's where it serves justice, that where it could actually do its job and do its role well, and is to build that vision. Because the arts and the literature and the humanities is where that comes in. That's where humanistic forms of expression come in to bring us together. And politics on the other side, rather not our politics, but their politics, is meant to distract and kind of push us away from any form of future. And that's why I said that I really, for example, the Massive Attack song is very resonant with sort of my sort of form of like political futurism. And I say political futurism and not sci-fi, because sci-fi is a whole colonial genre of itself. It doesn't exist in the Middle East. There are forms of science fiction, but sci-fi as a genre, there's no translation to it in Arabic or any other like non-English language necessarily. So ultimately, I just think that there's a really deep like urgency and need for music that is, one, able to build that vision, two, builds it in a way that has indigenous sovereignty and a reclamation of land and return to our indigenous land, and the right to stay and remain is very crucial. And then more importantly, a vision for how we can all mobilize together and live together continuously against imperialism, because it's not, you know, over a day or a night that this is going to end. But I think what we should start with today and now is to build that vision together.
Absolutely. That's so beautifully said. And jumping back to the first part of a question, I'm jumping around a little bit, but now kind of onto you and your work. Obviously, the audience know a little about you, but I'd love to, you know, for someone that maybe doesn't understand much about your deep work and research in climate and all the amazing things that you have built, it would be great to, learn what you've discovered and what you are trying to achieve through your work.
So whenever I would explain this, I would always start by talking about Palestine from early 1920s. A lot of people tend to talk about October 7. A lot of people tend to even go back to 1948, which is more correct. But then obviously Israel wasn't created over a day or a night. The 1947 partition plan by the UN wasn't also just a form of complete power giving to the Jewish population, but rather it was early 1920s. Jews were living in Palestine with the Palestinians. At the time, approximately 20% of the population was Jewish, 80% of that was Arab Palestinian. And obviously in early 1920s, especially with, how fossil capitalism was established, how the Seven Sisters sort of oil companies at the time, with the Anglo-Iranian Company, British Petroleum, etc., were setting their foot into the Middle East. We saw that especially with the Anglo-Iranian Company, and then later on with the establishment of the Kirkuk-Haifa pipeline, that these, first of all, I think from my perspective as someone who focuses on energy a lot, there's a whole field of energy politics and energy humanities that looks into this, because a lot of these establishments relied on arts and humanities first and foremost, propaganda as a way to, first of all, create a narrative about the Arabs in, for example, American media. I mean, that was huge. There were many sort of different posters. I'm sure that a lot of the audience has seen a lot of these posters of even, progress and modernity. And later on, we saw how a lot of these colonial narratives kind of shifted to a more kind of neo-colonial, and even, for example, we saw Israeli narratives of making the desert bloom and, it was empty and so on. So colonial narratives from like a humanities arts perspectives are very entrenched in that society building, or even like apartheid kind of constructing sort of way. But yeah, 1920s, we saw the introduction of electricity, or so-called introduction, by a Russian Zionist, Phineas Rutenberg. 1923, electricity was introduced, co-opted by the Palestinian kind of government at the time under the British mandate. People were resisting, people were boycotting electricity. That was more than 100 years ago, and that was the first kind of boycott movement. And that, to me, also serves as a symbol of power, as a symbol of resistance, but also the fact that things haven't changed. And if anything, the same logic of imperialism and same sort of logic even of extermination and how Zionism functions remains the same. And I think that's a really important sort of trace back to history that we should always look at, because around 15 years later, in 1936, we saw the first kind of resistance move towards sabotage, where people were sabotaging energy infrastructure as a way to kind of blow up the pipeline, which was a call that Andreas Malm and others in the climate movement were pushing for around like 2018 onwards. And this is now what's happening with the energy embargo, and is to cut down those supply chains of imperialism and that whole like war machine. So to me, understanding that infrastructure logic, how Palestine is created on that injustice, how 80% of electricity was provided to 20% of the population, 20% of electricity was given to 80%. And we draw parallels with that now. I mean, there's a film that we had sort of at SOAS as a screening with the Refugee Week, and it went really well. I do not remember the name of the film at the top of my head, but it was a film about two farmers, one land in Area C of the West Bank. And the first line of that film was 80% of the water is distributed to 20% of the population. And Area C of the West Bank houses a lot of illegal Israeli settlements. And that obviously is illegal. And the thing is that whole parallel of resources and even energy in general being the way that people live differently and being the sort of first kind of step towards creating injustice, I think that is a very crucial point, and that's not very exclusive to the Palestinian case, but it's very sort of inclusive to all cases of evil, injustice, imperialism, and so on. So with that kind of context, any form of Palestinian politics, even talking about warfare, talking about conflict, talking about negotiations, talking about anything, that as long as that logic is present in my conversation, it is very clear what the answer is, and it's very clear how that sort of system is created. So when we're talking about Palestine, especially during the genocide, I said this before, it's this idea that genocide is an erasure, it's a systemic extermination of people, and you cannot do that unless you make the land uninhabitable. So for Palestinians at the moment, Gaza is completely uninhabitable. I mean, we saw sort of UNDP reports that talk about how much gas, like GHG emissions, is going to sort of produce if we were to clean up the rubble, let alone from the military kind of warfare that we just saw and witnessed in Palestine. Besides the human loss, besides the complete urban like life loss, scholasticide, any form of just genocide in general, we saw a complete like example of that. But then more importantly, on the environmental warfare front, what we're witnessing in Palestine as a whole, ever since the early 1920s, or with the establishment of the Zionist project in the late 1800s, we saw a strategy that looks at creating a system of water apartheid, that looks at a system of entrenching energy, imperialism, and corporate complicity now with global capitalism, in a way that every corporation, even Spotify, is now complicit. And Spotify is meant to be a music platforming service. The same with Netflix, the same with movies, the same with every other form of literature. People are complicit, corporations are complicit, and it's this complete like getting rid of the main perpetrator of violence and spreading that responsibility of injustice in general. So, and that goes back to even climate change, and it goes back to this proliferation of fossil fuels and how we now see the argument for climate justice being very connected to Palestinian liberation, being connected to the liberation of all people, because it's the same corporations that kill the people in Gaza that are also fueling the climate crisis, is deeply connected early on from the 1920s all the way to now. British Petroleum, Dana, ENI Petroleum, Petrobras, Vitol, Shell, Chevron, like they're all deeply complicit. We saw that in all the reports that we worked on, all the reports that Oil Change International, Data Desk, SOMO, Shadow Magazine have all worked on, Disrupt Power, the global energy embargo for Palestine. There's so much research. I think more than ever now, just to end this kind of one note, is that we need arts and music and culture to come in to use that evidence-backed kind of advocacy and turn it into real impact, or be part of that mission for liberation, for justice. Because if we continue to ignore that reality on the ground, because we've had enough evidence, we have enough data, it's about time that we begin transforming the way that we live and transforming the culture that we live in, transforming the music that we listen to, that's also deeply programmed into our lives. And I think, you know, we shouldn't have music that normalizes suffering. We should have music that politicizes our lives and shifts the way that we live.
There just aren't the words for how important it is to understand this. But before we go into more questions, we're going to do a break for our breather. And I know that you there's a clip that we'd like to share. So if you'd like to, tell us a little bit about the clip that we're about to listen to.
Absolutely. So I think we will be looking at Professor Rafeef Ziadah's poem from sort of 2011, talking about how Gaza was massacred and how these massacres are on TV, and how she was interviewed by a journalist asking just for a simple soundbite, and how journalism is deeply biased in a way that doesn't actually present the realities on the ground, but rather presents what media wants to present it as. So it was her very perfectly capturing that feeling as a Palestinian being questioned time and time again about your own humanity, and about the, you know, how can you translate your suffering into something that contributes to our propaganda and contributes to our media biases. And she did it in a way that any person listening to her speech and poem is able to comprehend that so easily. And it's such a powerful speech. So I'm very excited.
Today, my body was a TV'd massacre. Today, my body was a TV'd massacre that had to fit into sound bites and word limits. Today, my body was a TV'd massacre that had to fit into sound bites and word limits, filled enough with statistics to counter measured response. And I perfected my English and I learned my UN resolutions. But still, he asked me, Ms. Ziadah, don't you think everything would be resolved if you would just stop teaching so much hatred to your children? Pause. I look inside of me for strength to be patient, but patience is not at the tip of my tongue as the bombs drop over Gaza. Patience has just escaped me. Pause. Smile. We teach life, sir. Rafeef, remember to smile. Pause. We teach life, sir. We Palestinians teach life after they have occupied the last sky. We teach life after they have built their settlements and apartheid walls. After the last skies, we teach life, sir. But today, my body was a TV'd massacre made to fit into sound bites and word limits. And just give us a story, a human story. You see, this is not political. We just want to tell people about you and your people. So give us a human story. Don't mention that word apartheid and occupation. This is not political. You have to help me as a journalist to help you tell your story, which is not a political story. Today, my body was a TV'd massacre. How about you give us a story of a woman in Gaza who needs medication? How about you? Do you have enough bone-broken limbs to cover the sun? Hand me over your dead and give me the list of their names in 1,200 word limits. Today, my body was a TV'd massacre made to fit into sound bites and word limits and move those that are desensitized to terrorist blood. But they felt sorry. They felt sorry for the cattle over Gaza. So I give them UN resolutions and statistics, and we condemn and we deplore and we reject. And these are not two equal sides, occupier and occupied, and 100 dead, 200 dead, and 1,000 dead. And between that war crime and massacre, I vent out words and smile, not exotic. Smile, not terrorist. And I recount 100 dead, 200 dead, 1,000 dead. Is anyone out there? Will anyone listen? I wish I could wail over their bodies. I wish I could just run barefoot in every refugee camp and hold every child, cover their ears so they wouldn't have to hear the sound of bombing for the rest of their life the way I do. Today, my body was a TV'd massacre, and let me just tell you, there is nothing your UN resolutions have ever done about this. And no soundbite I come up with, no matter how good my English gets, no soundbite will bring them back to life. No soundbite will fix this. We teach life, sir. We teach life, sir. We Palestinians wake up every morning to teach the rest of the world life, sir.
So, Mohammed, being someone who is so deeply aware of the world's grief, its fractures, the systems that need changing, the hope that we might be able to solve even a fraction of it in our lifetime, you know, it's so inspiring hearing you speak, and everything, like, there's no doubt the listeners are going to be so inspired by your work. But you're also a person, and you are, you do need to keep a sense of, clarity and well-being for yourself. So I'm really interested in, I guess, how you keep that sense of moral clarity and also how you look after yourself.
No, absolutely. I mean, I previously spoke about some Palestinian artists kind of resisting that idea of kind of serving the movement or serving the cause by serving through some output, through some music that plays a narrative or plays a part in our resistance. But the basic fact that that music and that show of power has just went through and has gotten its own platform in its own way, in its own, considering the consistent active erasure against Palestinians is very strong itself. For my own work and for myself, I feel like that continuous denial of the fact that Palestinians are dehumanized is it plays a crucial part in how I even develop my own personhood. As a young person, I feel like all Palestinians have been going through a major identity crisis, especially being under such immense pressure by many. I mean, also being a Palestinian currently in diaspora. Is a whole issue of mobility and just statehood, especially when sort of there was that call for recognition of statehood for Palestine being a deeply problematic one, because similar to, for example, even false climate solutions kind of knocking out or even just getting the idea that we should tackle the system of injustice to begin with is completely kind of drowned in all the sound that distracts us now. So I think for myself as a person, as a Palestinian, I reaffirm my own belief of justice through a connection to other people's struggles. The boycott, divestment, sanctions movement call to action is not one that is just meant for Palestinians, but this call to action for justice and a recognition of people's sovereignty is crucial to all of our work, I think, as humans and as people to the world. One of the things that deeply resonate with me is sort of working with Colombian union workers and hearing from them about how they were targeted by, for example, Coca-Cola, how they would receive death threats and how they wouldn't be able to live normally because they're living under that threat of life while the continuous sort of exploitation of land occurs. And Nestle, Pepsi, and Cola were all, they all had a case or an allegation of being very deeply sort of entrenched in a system of fracking within sort of Latin America in general. A lot of that is more known, especially with pollution, especially even sort of entrenchment of oil companies with the pollution. In Venezuela, for example, is one case where a lot of film and art has been created on the topic. So for me as Mohammed, for the past 9 months now, having a political vegan, I'm just a bit more worried about my consumption. The same way that we should be sort of aware about our consumption of digital media. I'm also more worried about my own consumption of my own food. So my intake, what do I consume in terms of media? What do I consume in terms of just language? As we see a lot of dehumanizing language, and there's been this big push against the New York Times and other media outlets about how do they actually frame things. But then from, I think, a very personal level, I completely reject any form of consumption that would be connected to the global empire that is, continues feeding itself of people's suffering. And I don't think I can feed myself out of that whole supply chain either. So I think even from an agricultural and sort of livestock lens, besides the animal abuse and the sort of pollution and greenhouse gas emissions that go into feeding that industrial system, which is deeply capitalist, it turns sort of animals' lives and our supply chains and our peoples and communities and farms and farmers and seeds and produce as a simple profit. I think I completely denounce that. I don't accept it. I think the way forward is for us to work from the ground up. And a transition of our food system, of our agricultural system is needed. A transition that is just in terms of how we see energy systems, in terms of how we see livelihoods. A just transition is needed in the music industry, in all industries, so that we can actually live with basic principles that align with whatever a human rights framework is. So that just transition should come from the ground up. It should come from people and not governments. It should come from people and not systems of profit. So yeah, and I do my part by focusing on what I can control, and that would be my consumption.
Yeah, I think that's such an important message, and it's a hopeful message as well. The BDS movement, to me, it is a people's movement, and it's a hopeful message because it is something that people can do. We can make different choices with what brands we consume and what we don't. There will be a lot of people listening who care a lot about the issues that have been brought up during this podcast episode. And they may be, first thing is to look up the BDS movement and make sure you're boycotting these brands. But aside from that, people who want to get more involved in work around justice, maybe they don't know where to start. What would you say to somebody who's listening that feels that way?
I think one should always start local. The whole theory of change for us as Palestinians and for myself and the organization that I'm leading and the movement that we're building is that we should connect our struggles across the globe. It's not just about fixing another person's problem. It's about fixing the problems that we all suffer from. We've had cases where people were like, oh, well, I don't have a system of oppression that I would kind of label within my sort of area. But I think it's crucial to then see who in your community is left behind. There are people always left behind, and that is a form of injustice. That is a sort of negligence of that is a form of dehumanization of another. We're all equal, and I think that is something that we should all preach. I don't see why people should hesitate to say that another person in another community is worth less or worth more than anybody else. So this basic principle that we should all act for change within our own communities is crucial, because that change is like a domino effect. It triggers more change. It triggers a movement. It triggers a pattern. And we've seen that across movements, across anti-apartheid struggle, anti-racist struggles. We should work within our different movements. And I think for us, it's just simply sort of establishing that logic of infrastructure, of control, of domination, of extermination, of occupation, of apartheid, making it very clear how, for the past 100 years, how did that system develop? And over the past 100 years, how did that same system develop across the globe? How did that same system develop in Asia, in the Pacific, in Europe, in Africa? How are people left behind in all these different regions? And how is our system of oppression connected? But how is our struggle connected? How is our resistance connected? I think that's a crucial question that we should all ask. And I think the easiest way to kind of approach it is look at corporate complicity. We all have corporations and profit-seeking companies and organizations that are after our blood, that profit by using our blood, that profit the more that we lose. And that is not human. That is not the humanistic approach to life, and that is not respectful nor holding to dignity. And I think what we all seek as humans is dignity. And this is something that Palestinians have really been looked up to within sort of different sort of struggle movements or anti-struggle movements, is that Palestinians really deeply hold this idea of like dignity and integrity in the struggle. This idea of ecological belonging, or sort of even Sumud and steadfastness in the land, is really crucial. And I think as long as we have the right principles as people, then that's what comes first. So look after your own neighbor, look after your own community, see how your complicity is intertwined in that whole global complicit structure of genocide and of apartheid. It's a really tight grid, and I think it's a matter of just breaking free from that.
That's such an important message, that we do live in this tight grid, and to see who's left behind and to work on something locally that you can actually make a direct impact with. So I really, really love that. Thank you. Now, the very last question that I do ask all guests is, if there were one message that you would like our collective descendants in 100 years' time to receive, what would that message be?
If I had one message to reach people 100 years from now, I think it would be to not forego of their humanity, or to not let go of their basic principles that makes them human. We come from community, we come from love, we come from people who came together to create families, and the way that the world has developed has completely ignored that, has completely dehumanized the future. And I think a message to the future would be to not forget where we came from, and not to forget what we stand for. And that's justice for all, and that's love for all, and that's that no one person belongs to stand on the remnants of other people and on the destruction of another people. So I hope that the next generation is able to carry that message forward, and to ensure that, from corporations to governments to borders and land, we're able to live freely, without obstruction, without profit-seeking efforts that destroy our basic fabric of society.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. That was a beautiful message. And thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Well, that was a really interesting conversation. And I was sat in the room while this interview took place. I'm Sean, the founder of Drown in Sound, the producer of this podcast, and I'm here with Ariana, and we're going to discuss a few things that we both took away from it. But I think my main thing was how smart and impressive and powerful his voice was. Not that that is unexpected, because I'd already seen him speak a few months ago in Brian Eno's studio, and I messaged you going, I think this guy should be on the podcast. He's great. But how did you find that conversation? What were some of your takeaways?
I don't even know where to start, to be honest. Firstly, I just thoroughly enjoyed sitting with Mohammed. He's such a lovely and gentle character. He's so easy and pleasurable to talk with. So I just really, really enjoyed every moment of it. And I have so many notes and things that I took away. I almost wouldn't, it would be a 3-hour podcast in itself, going through all the things that, really resonated with me and that I took away from it. But I guess one of the things is, we spoke at the start about this idea of a liminal space. And I guess that was what his song choice represented as well. And we're in a liminal space at the moment as a society, as a whole. But then it's very difficult to start imagining. Well, it's difficult, but not impossible to start imagining the future we're trying to build before the old system has collapsed. We're still in the devastation of what's going on. We're still in the collapse right now.
You can't build a new house till you move the rubble out of the way, quite literally.
Quite literally, that really is it on a very, that's even the case for us personally. There's lots of theory around psychology that it's very hard to almost move on in life when you're still stuck in pain and trauma of something that, it's kind of, you want to move that energy before you can really move on into something new. And that's the space we're in right now. And it's a really difficult space. And we are trying to build and reimagine new futures while the collapse is still happening. A genocide is still taking place. Entire bloodlines from his community are being completely eradicated. And it's such a painful, and there's not even a word to describe how that's why we're working within the medium of music, because music does share emotions and feelings in a way that language sometimes can't. And I think that's why I turn to music so much, because sometimes, I don't have the words for how I really feel about what's going on in Palestine, the genocide in Gaza, equally what's going on in Sudan, what's going on in Congo. Like, I don't have the words because the injustice feels so painful and so deep for me. And what he was saying, that music and sound can be used to tell these stories that can transcend, I guess, the walls of oppression.
I think one other thing this is going to sound really stupid, but how few Palestinian voices I've heard over the last 2.5 years. Like, I can name the few voices that regularly appear on the media and on the news, and the people that appear in my feed, and how many people there are that I could name. Like, I feel like it's quite similar to the so-called trans debate, where I can think of a handful of trans voices that I've ever heard speak on the media. And yet it's a story which has dominated our media discourse for 5 years or more. Like, I know far more about the life of J.K. Rowling than I do of any number of trans people. And but like, for instance, I've heard Kneecap speak far more about Palestine than I have Palestinian voices. And that doesn't seem right to me. Like, I'm always of the school that you pass the mic, you don't kind of take up space. He says taking up space on your podcast.
Yeah, I mean, it's even the way Western journalists spoke for so long about how, we haven't, we aren't exactly sure what's going on in Gaza because we haven't had any journalists go in. And of course, Israel knew that. They knew that if Western journalists weren't allowed in, then they are just less likely to listen to it actually gives me it makes me quite emotional to speak about it, but the amount of incredible journalists in Gaza reporting, with absolute destruction everywhere and then being killed. And we're not hearing as much from Gaza now, it's now end of December 2025, because most of the journalists have been killed. And, you know, that's part of the problem that we have with this really centralised approach to media.
Because in a lot of ways, you'd think, well, you can't report from there. So to be balanced and impartial, you shouldn't just put out the propaganda of the people that are preventing you to report from there.
Yeah.
Like, you would think that the world's media would take a stand and go, well, if you're not going to give us access, we're not going to report on what you're saying.
You'd think. You'd think.
Like when the Associated Press did that thing where they refused to call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America and were kicked out of the White House, I would have thought that the vast majority of our media would stand in solidarity with their colleagues and refuse to report but instead we've got all of these compliant people who are part of the infrastructure of those systems, who are funded by the same billionaires that fund the campaigns. And that's a big thing. And I think that it's one way of just like looking at how the media doesn't do its job. But like, what's the excuse in Congo?
Yeah.
What's the excuse in Lebanon? Like, there are various other stories the media doesn't do the level of reporting that is done on Ukraine, which I think the reporting on Ukraine is incredibly important to do fairly and accurately. But for instance, the BBC have a Ukrainian reporter who was born in Ukraine, reporting on Ukraine. She literally reported on the house on her street where she grew up being bombed. She's a brilliant journalist. I don't think it impacts her journalism at all, but you wouldn't see the same. I mean, there was a Palestinian journalist reporting for the BBC, but not from inside of Gaza. So I think that the ways that stories are told and how they're told, like, I think the interview with Karishma Patel as well is similarly like entwined and interconnected. So maybe this is the last episode of the series, as we've not organized which order they're going out in yet. So that maybe that all those dots get joined, or anyway.
Yeah. And I mean, you know, I think with those two examples you just brought up, Congo, you know, since the first democratically elected Prime Minister of Congo, Patrice Lumumba, since he was assassinated, I think it was in the 60s, but someone might need to correct me there, might have been the 70s. The Congo has been in a 60, 70-year tailspin of Western dictatorships, each of them having control over the gold mines, the various resources, the cobalt. And it is every single piece of technology we have, the literal phone that I'm using, the laptop in front of me, is a product of that chain. And there is so much corporate interest tied into keeping the Congo the way it is. And so, of course, if people really knew what was going on there, then I think things would be different. And you know, even with Lebanon, you know, the amount of work the Israel lobby and Lawyers for Israel did to get Hezbollah signed up as a terrorist organization however many years ago. And that happened over many years, and then they succeeded, and they are a terrorist organization now in the UK law. And so because of that, there are a huge amount of laws and pressures to not then go in and report, I guess, diligently within Lebanon. So the examples, I think, you know, for every case, the examples you can keep giving examples of all of these different, and that's why I do also believe they're all completely interconnected.
We should probably end this episode there, because we've got other things to do, and I'm sure people have got pause buttons and probably haven't got as far as this podcast. If you did get to the end of this podcast, you can obviously drop us a line and tell us what you've been thinking of this series. I've been Sean Adams, the producer of Sounds Like Change, and you have been.
And I'm Ariana. I've been your host of Sounds Like Change. It has been an absolute pleasure to have you here, and I really look forward to seeing you next time.